Hello everyone, welcome to the MYD iGEM Pitching Series 2020 session on climate policies, laws and regulations. In this session, we will introduce Malaysian climate policies, laws and regulations. Our speakers will also introduce and discuss new policies, laws and regulations that could be adopted by Malaysia. My name is Julian and I will be your moderator for today. The purpose of this pitching session is to bring awareness on climate change issues and the current or upcoming policy, legal, and regulatory solutions that are available to help tackle these issues. The solutions provided today are meant to instill awareness and motivate people to action. Additionally, while we may not have any initiatives in regard to these solutions, as we are learning as well, we want to gather insights from the vast background participants such as yourselves that iGEM brings. Through these insights, we hope to identify the most promising method and potentially get the ball rolling for the right initiatives in the near future. Ultimately, the session is meant to encourage action and stir inspiration. Before we go into the pitching session, I will outline today's agenda and provide introductions to the Malaysian Youth Delegation, the topic of today's pitching session, as well as the speakers. I will then continue with a short explanation of why we should care about climate change. Then I will clarify why climate change is so intractable. I will outline governance as a possible pathway towards solving for climate change and provide definitions of what is a policy, law, and regulation. I will then conclude this introduction section with a concise introduction on climate policy and law in Malaysia. After this introduction section, the floor will be handed over to three speakers who will take turns to pitch their solutions. This will be followed by a live Q&A session open to the audience. There will be a time for voting. And finally, the session will conclude with the reveal of the winning pitch and some closing remarks. For the benefit of those just joining us, let me briefly introduce the Malaysian Youth Delegation, MYD. MYD was founded in 2015 as a youth-led climate policy research, advocacy, and diplomacy organization. MYD undertakes workshops and climate and research projects to enhance youth literacy and climate change and policy, connects Malaysian youth with global climate policy and environmental institutions by representing Malaysian youth at international climate conferences, such as the COPs, engages state, civil society, and academic leaders to influence policy and research priorities, and also makes the latest thinking on climate change more accessible to the general public. So why should we care about climate change, and why do climate solutions matter? Climate change is one of the defining challenges contemporary humanity faces. How humanity deals with climate change will have a significant impact on the fates of not just those living today, but also on the fates of future generations of humans who are yet to be born. Human civilization has developed under relatively stable climatic conditions over the course of human history. Climate change could threaten the continuity of human civilization. Furthermore, climate change will also harm other living beings on planet Earth, as it will increase the risk of many species going extinct. In fact, climate change is listed as a threat for almost a fifth of species threatened with extinction on the International Union of Conservation of Nature for the Conservation of Nature's Red List. Climate change and biodiversity loss are interrelated crises. There is no planet B, and we have a responsibility to take action to save the only planetary home we have. Furthermore, Malaysia and Southeast Asia are forecast to be seriously affected by climate change. According to Malaysia's second biennial update report to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, published in 2018, by 2050, the average air temperature of Malaysia is forecasted to be up to 1.6 degrees Celsius warmer than historical averages, making harmful heat waves more likely. By 2050, the annual rainfall of central Malaysia, including the economically significant Klang Valley, is meanwhile projected to be 10.6% higher than historical averages, leading to increased river flows. For example, the average mean annual flow of the Klang River Basin is projected to be 5.0% higher than historical levels in 2050. The increased rainfall and river flows will increase the risk of devastating floods across most river basins in Malaysia. Flash floods such as those that recently inundated Masjid Jamek and other parts of central Kuala Lumpur will become more frequent. Meanwhile, according to the Global Climate Risk Index 2020, 4 of the world's 10 countries most affected by climate change are located in Southeast Asia: Myanmar, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. While all ASEAN member states are susceptible to climate impacts such as sea level rise, extreme weather events like extreme drought and flood, the effects are more pronounced in countries with significant low elevation coastal areas. These countries are more likely to be negatively affected by increasingly frequent tropical storms and typhoons due to climate change. Scientific research shows that climate change will have serious harmful consequences for Malaysia, Southeast Asia, as well as humanity and the planet as a whole. There's international consensus that something must be done about climate change. There are solutions that we know about. Yet why does climate change still seem like an intractable problem that's so hard to address? This is because climate change is actually a type of problem known as the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is a concept made widely known by American ecologist Derek Hardin. The commons refers to land and other shared resources that are owned by no one, / they are owned by everyone. A tragedy of the commons is a situation in a shared resource system where individual users acting independently, according to their own self-interest, behave contrary to the common good of all users by depleting or despoiling the shared resource through their collective action. Examples of pollution, overfishing, overgrazing, as previously mentioned, climate change. So overgrazing is a classic example of the tragedy of the commons and how the mechanism behind it. So, for example, villagers in a village who share a common pasture where their cows graze. All the villagers have, and that is the commons. All the villagers have an interest in ensuring the pasture, the commons, is sustainable. However, individual villagers who add an extra cow to their herd on the pasture gain an advantage over others. The impact of one extra cow on the pasture is minimal. Nevertheless, since other villagers are also rational and want to maximize personal benefits and expect others to behave the same way, they will also add extra cows to their herds on the pasture. The impact of the extra cows adds up and the pasture ends up being overgrazed, an outcome no one initially desired. So this is the underlying mechanism behind the tragedy of the commons, and a similar mechanism occurs with regard to climate change. Everyone has a climate budget, a carbon budget. All countries have a carbon budget. However, if a country or a person exceeds the individual carbon budget, they can potentially gain an economic advantage. Hence, individuals, countries have an incentive to exceed their carbon budget out of self-interest, out of rational self-interest, and everyone acts in the same way and thinks the same way. That results in the tragedy of the commons, where everyone is exceeding their carbon budgets, leading to excessive carbon in the atmosphere and climate change. And how can the tragedy of the commons be resolved? So Hardin, who came up with the concept, did not believe technical solutions could resolve the tragedy of the commons. He proposed privatization as a potential solution. However, certain types of commons, such as water bodies and the atmosphere, are actually difficult to privatize, and because they cannot actually be parceled up the way a piece of land is. And also, Hardin had argued against relying on conscience, as he believed that this favored free riders as opposed to those who are more altruistic in the system. Since neither the state nor the market have actually been very successful in solving shared resource problems, this tragedy of the commons, how can it actually be resolved then? So in her research, Nobel Prize-winning economist Elinor Ostrom found communities in countries such as Switzerland, Kenya, Guatemala, Nepal, Turkey, and others that have successfully devised ways to govern the commons / shared resources to assure survival for their needs in future generations. So for example, Swiss villagers who have common agreements dating back several centuries that no one's allowed to graze more cows in the meadow than it can care for over the winter to prevent their grazing. So hence the solution for a tragedy of the commons actually is governance, proper governance. And Ostrom, out of her research, she proposed 8 principles. Out of her research, Ostrom proposed 8 principles for sustainable, equitable governance of commons, which are illustrated on this slide. So in international climate change frameworks, meanwhile, they are an attempt to resolve the climate change with tragedy of the commons through governance, through international governance, and key components of this international system are outlined here in this slide, such as UNFCCC, Paris Agreement, and the COPs, the Conference of Parties. And now we move on to climate change policy. What is climate change policy? It encompasses policies that are formulated specifically to tackle climate change. They can be local, national, international in scope, Two broad categories of climate change policies are mitigation, which are policies designed to reduce the sources or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases, and adaptation, which are policies intended to govern and drive the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate change and its effects. Now we move on to defining policies and laws and regulations. What is a policy? A policy is basically general principles for guidance. They are only documents and not laws. Policies can, however, lead to new laws. So an example of a climate-sensitive policy in Malaysia is Malaysia's roadmap towards zero single-use plastic. It will be implemented by state governments. So the so-called ban on straws is not actually a ban, merely an advisory. And the aim is to review existing laws around single-use plastic in 2019. Now, what is a law then? A law is an implemented act where people are legally bound to abide by its obligations, and violations of laws come with a penalty. So a law is basically something that has gone through the lawmaking process in Parliament here in Malaysia. And examples of climate-sensitive laws that have been passed by federal government include the Environmental Quality Act 1974, Environmental Quality Order 1989, Protection of Wildlife Act, Fisheries Act 1985, National Parks Act 1980, and so on. What is a regulation? A regulation can be defined as something that's created by governmental agencies. It's often to implement a law. It is enforceable. However, it's not a law. It does not have the same scope as a law, because regulations only affect those who deal directly with the agency who is enforcing them, as compared to laws which apply to everyone. Regulations can, however, be used to support laws. Now that policies, laws, and regulations have been defined, let me introduce the climate policy and regulatory landscape in Malaysia. So in 2010, Malaysia attained a major milestone in drafting the National Climate Change Policy. And the 5 principles of the climate change policy, National Climate Change Policy, are development sustainable path, conservation of the environment and natural resources, coordinated implementation, effective participation, and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So the 5th principle means that, for example, developing countries have different responsibilities, and with regards taking into account historical circumstances and their respective capabilities. What are possible next steps for climate governance in Malaysia? So what can Malaysia do? It can take steps to legislate the Climate Change Act, and the previous government had mentioned that it was considering doing this and exploring this option of legislating a Climate Change Act, which would mainstream climate action for governments and businesses in Malaysia, and make, for example, emissions target legally enforceable. The government's also exploring drafting a national adaptation plan, which would be really crucial for a country like Malaysia that is vulnerable to climate risk. So adaptation would be really much needed for Malaysia to adapt to, for example, increased flooding risk, increased heat wave risk. What other options are there besides these aforementioned measures? So there are other potential policy and governance steps that Malaysia could take to address climate change. And our 3 speakers for today's pitch session will each be proposing a potential solution. So our first speaker, Nior from MYD, will present the blue carbon policy. Our second speaker, Juchi from MYD, will present on introducing the environmental taxation policy. Our third speaker, Roshan, or Roshwinder for Ho, also from MYD, will present on introducing a new legislation called Ecocide. Thank you for your attention. I now hand the floor to the first speaker, Nior, to present on the blue carbon policy. Thank you.
Hello and hi everyone. My name is Mior M. Hakim, and today I'll be presenting and pitching to you about the National Blue Carbon Policy. Before we deep dive into this topic, I would like to inform you I'm in no means or actually an expert in this topic, but I do have some thoughts about it and I would like to share it with you guys as well. So let's go into the contents and see what we're gonna learn a bit for today. So for today, we're gonna go into a bit of introduction on what exactly is blue carbon. Then we're gonna talk about the Malaysian mangrove, and then I'm gonna pitch about a national blue carbon policy, and you will learn about the objective of this policy basically, and see what others blue carbon activities has been implemented in other countries that we can implement as well in Malaysia. And last but not least, we can go into the next step on how can we achieve this blue carbon policy. All right, let's go. What is exactly a blue carbon policy? You may have heard about a brown carbon, a green carbon before. So green carbon is basically a carbon stored and captured and stored by the forest. That's why it has a green leaf and all. It's called a green carbon. There's another one we call it brown carbon. It's actually stored in the cloud and also stored in the atmosphere. So you call it a brown carbon. As by now, you might have realized that blue carbon basically any carbon dioxide actually being stored by a water bodies or ocean. But for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to present you the definition given by IUCN, a conservation national. Basically, blue carbon is defined as the carbon stored, sequestered, or released by the coastal ecosystem of tidal marsh, mangrove, and seagrass meadows. So the pictures that you have on the right is basically what where exactly the carbon is actually stored. So why blue carbon ecosystem? It's because the blue carbon ecosystem they play in a critical role in capturing and store the carbon for a long term. Hence, it's reducing the impact of climate change. It has been done, it's been known through the studies that actually carbon stored by the blue carbon or through this medium actually hold or stored for millennials as compared to the one had in a green carbon, which is actually stored around decades or centuries. So it actually is much superior and it stored much more. Why is that? A simple analogy of this is the green carbon are actually stored above ground while the blue carbon is actually stored underground. To illustrate what I'm trying to explain is carbon dioxide actually is being absorbed through photosynthesis and all, and it is actually sequestered. In mangrove, it's sequestered to the woody biomass and actually stored inside the soil underground. Same goes for the tidal marsh and also the seagrass in the sea. So it actually stored underground as compared to the green carbon that actually stored in the leaf, in the branch, and in the bark of the tree. So yeah, when it's stored in the soil, it can be kept for a longer time. So that's why it's much superior in that way. So the coastal ecosystem or blue carbon ecosystem are quite big. It's not as big as the green carbon or forestry, but then we do have a long coastline all over the world. And in the coastline we have mangrove, salt marsh, we have seagrasses. In Malaysia, as we know, we have a lot of mangrove, right? So yeah, let's talk about our Malaysian mangrove. So what's about Malaysian mangrove? We have around 575,000 to 578,000 hectares of mangrove forest, and this will translate to around 590 million tons of carbon storage potential. As you can see, this storage potential is quite huge, and we can actually leverage on that because we are living in a place where we can actually plant this mangrove and make it even bigger and can make it a better ecosystem for them. Mangrove in Malaysia is basically governed by both national park and also the state authority in some places. And this actually cause some threats because under the state authority, it might not be gazetted under permanent reserve forest. What that means is that if the state decided to develop that area, then the forest can be removed, and it means that we have a reduced mangrove cover, which ultimately means that we have a less carbon sink. You know, right? That's the reason. And then the challenges of Malaysian mangrove is basically outside challenges is including a sustainable exploitation, lack of priority because conservation of mangrove is not always as high as conservation of forests over online, and also there's external threat such as oil spills. There's also plastic pollution from oceans and all, and it also incurs a substantial cost to actually maintain such big ecosystem in a mangrove, and also there's a variation of mangrove management and practices between states to states. So there's not much consolidation on this, and this actually causes challenges for our mangroves to actually to being conserved because of a lot of this issue. A unique characteristic of mangrove is actually they maintain almost a similar size unless given an external force. In the case that we have in the picture right now, what we're seeing that if we are developing too many or too near to the mangrove ecosystem, and then the sea level rising, which is something that we know happening right now because of the climate change, we are actually restricting the mangrove forest to very limited space, meaning that we are reducing our carbon storage potential. So this is bad. So that's why I wanted to Malaysia to introduce and establish a national blue carbon policy. So what's the objective to have a national blue carbon policy? There are three main areas that we should cover. The first and foremost is we must conserve and rehabilitate our coastal ecosystem, especially for the mangrove forest, because we know that the mangrove ecosystem are retreating day by day. So we want to increase the mangrove ecosystem, mangrove forest that we had in Malaysia, expand it even more. Second is we can actually use our mangrove ecosystem or the coastal ecosystem to mitigate our climate change impact via carbon capture and storage. As well, we can use it into a carbon finance mechanism. Last but not least, the objective of our national blue carbon policy is to govern on how we develop such area. We want to facilitate sustainable use and restoration of coastal ecosystem through a blue carbon stock assessment, proper coastal management, and incentive to actually conserve our negative natural carbon sinks. So, blue carbon activities is not something new. It has been done quite some time for other countries. And what I'm going to share with you now is some of other blue carbon activities from other countries that they had done. So let's go. The first country that we're going to visit is Indonesia. So Indonesia is what they're trying to do is try to conserve their coastal ecosystem while at the same time empower their community development in Kaimana. So they developed a pilot project. Basically, what the pilot project wanted to achieve is creating a carbon credit, which actually can be purchased to help fund and benefit the indigenous community that actually living nearby the mangrove forest. So having a carbon credit meaning that they can plant and preserve and conserve the mangrove ecosystem, and this carbon credit can be can be traded by other parties outside that to offset the emission, and then the money that they receive or the profit that they receive would be used to conserve the area, the mangrove ecosystem, the coastal ecosystem, the community development at the same time to empower the economy over there because they do have a sustainable farming in the mangrove area. That's Indonesia. That's one of the blue carbon activities that they had. Second that we can go is we can go to Costa Rica. So what they do in Costa Rica, they did some carbon stock assessment. What they wanted to achieve here is they want to analyze about the carbon stock that they had and understand the changes of the mangrove covers over the years. Then they evaluate these economic scenarios to maintain and restore these specific areas of mangrove into its original area, and then use that as a blue carbon investment opportunity. So basically almost similar to a carbon credit where it can be purchased and offset emissions, and the fund that they're going to use is basically would be used to conserve the area even more. So that's in Costa Rica. And last on the USA, what they did here is not specifically on mangrove, they are doing it in the tidal marsh. What they want to achieve here is they run a market study to improve the condition of the tidal marsh. What happened here, they have been developing the area for quite some time, since 1909. They actually restricted the water flow inside this tidal marsh, and this causing a big issue over there. They actually reduced the tidal marsh coverage so extensively that the tidal marsh that actually supposed to be a carbon sink area become a carbon emission area, become a carbon emitter. So it's that bad. So what they want to do is to reverse the condition. So they want to destroy all the restriction that they have built before. So the restriction can be like dams, there can be like bridges that limits the water or tidal flow over the tidal marsh and also the sea, the oceans. So destroy that, let the natural flow of the tidal, so it allows it to be restored to its original glory. But to do that, they have to implement some kind of policy because it's some kind of development that has been done before, right? So they have to offset all of that. So this is what they are trying to do, try and make a study to understand the technical part, the economic part, financial and legal facility of doing that. So that's basically some of the carbon activities, blue carbon activities that we had in other countries. So how about Malaysia? What we can do about it? So some of the next step that we can do is first and foremost, the biggest thing that you should do to initiate communication and outreach on the blue carbon activities. Let people know and policymakers understand what is actually a blue carbon activities, because we might have done some of it, but it's not necessarily called as a blue carbon activities. After that, we can go into what is actually a policy for blue carbon and let people know how can we actually implement a blue carbon policy in Malaysia. Second step that we can do is basically to conduct a carbon stock assessment of existing coastal ecosystem. Then we can analyze the changes that are happening over the decades of the developments that we had. So by doing this, basically we can know where exactly we are in terms of our carbon stock. Are we actually becoming worse from 10 years ago? Are we becoming better? So stuff like that can be actually assessed and evaluate and analyze. So we can do that too first to help us to understand how we can make it even better for the policy. Last but not least, we can support the policy via the establishment of Blue Carbon Institute, then can help facilitate and bridge the link between the scientific activities or the scientific evidence to a policy implementation. Because we know policymakers not necessarily understand the scientific uh, research behind it, the scientific evidence behind of having a blue carbon ecosystem. So we have to educate people on that. So yeah, that's basically on a blue carbon policy, and this is what I want to propose. All in all, blue carbon policy is important in Malaysia, not only because we can help conserve our beloved mangrove forest, we can conserve the ecosystem over there, but at the same time, we can mitigate the climate change impact through carbon sink, and at the same time, we can create a new economy, a carbon finance mechanism that we can profit off, and also maintaining and restoring the mangrove area and also the coastal ecosystem to its original glory. And I think that's all from me. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Mior, for that fascinating presentation and pitch on the blue carbon policy. We now move on to our next speaker, Chichi from MYD, who will then present on introducing the environmental taxation policy. Chichi, the floor is yours.
A very good evening to everyone present here today. My name is Zichi, and I present to you my environmental taxation policy pitch for today's climate policy series. So first, I'm just going to walk you through what I intend to bring to the table today. First, with this policy, I intend to introduce a carbon tax, which is a fee that a government imposes on any company that burns fossil fuels. However, I intend to bring this a step forward, and I will explain it later on through my presentation. Later on, I'll bring you through the objectives, and then implementation, and last but not least, a few steps that we can take as with our capacities as individuals. So now jumping right into our objectives, I have two objectives. First is to discourage the use of fossil fuels, and second is to boost the economy. Now, discourage use of fossil fuels. To understand that, you have to understand the polluters pay principle, which is essentially a principle that is adapted from the UNFCCC, which is one of the key international frameworks when it comes to discussion of climate change. So the polluters pay principle essentially intend to make the polluters pay for the damages they have done. So by imposing a carbon tax upon big corporations as well as publics, this encourages environmental positive behavior change, because then with the carbon tax imposed, these common items that they usually purchase or the resources these big corporations usually opt for will be even more expensive than a greener and possibly renewable energy resource. So by imposing this carbon tax, this might change the minds of big corporations to opt for renewable energy or greener options, and then with that, this would actually bring forth environmental positive behavior change in a large scale, perhaps nationally. Now, moving on to the economy, with this tax imposed, the intention is to boost or stabilize the economy. With keeping that in mind, we need to understand that climate change is not a standalone event. And if the climate impacts actually impact a certain part of the globe, or perhaps in a global scale, the entire global community will be affected. And Malaysia cannot escape from that. So if people are suffering from climate change impacts, the economy will definitely will not be stabilized. So a very good example that we can refer to is Sweden's carbon tax, which actually reduced its carbon emission by 26%. However, during the same period, its economy grew by 78%. And I believe that Malaysia can follow the footsteps of Sweden by imposing carbon tax step by step. So those are the two objectives. Now, moving on to the implementation, the downside of the imposition of a carbon tax is that it is regressive, and it would appear to be burdensome on certain communities if it's imposed in a large scale and a very immediate effect and very sudden. So it must be introduced gradually so that it can be successful. So there are a few reference points that I would like to refer to, which are countries that have already imposed carbon tax and has been successful. So based on my reading, there are a total of 88 countries who intend to use carbon tax to meet their Paris Agreement goals. Some of you might be familiar, some of you might not, so I will just briefly explain. The Paris Agreement is one of the focal points of the important discussion of climate change. It is one of the newest international framework, and basically what the Paris Agreement intends to do is to ensure that the global temperature does not increase beyond 2 degrees Celsius. Because if the global temperature rise increases beyond 2 degrees Celsius, there will be very severe climate impacts that we might not be able to withhold. So that is the goal of the Paris Agreement. And the total 88 countries intend to use carbon tax to meet that goal of reducing carbon emission. And the 88 countries actually represent 56% of the global emissions. So this is a very positive outlook. Now, looking into the countries first, we have England. In 2013, Britain imposed tax per metric, 25 pounds tax per metric ton of carbon dioxide. And as a result, the utilities switched from coal to natural gas. And from that, the greenhouse gases emissions has fell to its lowest level since 1890. So that is something that shows the progress and the impact of carbon tax. Now, moving on to Japan. In Japan, the promotion of domestic business, installation of energy-saving equipment, as well as introduction of financial assistance for local government to promote energy saving and renewable energy, so-called Green New Deal funds in accordance with local characteristics. So as you can see, in Japan, carbon tax has also taken a very positive outlook. And back to Sweden. Over time in Sweden, the carbon tax has actually increased in importance and have contributed to a broad range of environmental and climate objectives. So for example, in Sweden, the carbon tax provides incentives to reduce energy consumption, improve energy efficiency, and increase the use of renewable energy alternatives. And that is what Malaysia can follow. So enough talking about other countries. Now I want to talk about Malaysia's context. So how I envision this tax being imposed is first we start off by carbon tax on big corporations for the use of fossil fuels. And that is because big corporations are essentially the people who are, my apologies, these big corporations are the ones who are most important, plays the biggest role in causing carbon emission globally. So they should be the ones who are paying for the most damages. So this should be imposed on big corporations because big corporations are the ones producing our everyday life products. And thus, from that will cause a change. And essentially, this would encourage, like what I mentioned before, would encourage environmental positive change behavior. As for a smaller community scale, we can start off by imposing carbon tax on second cars, because second cars essentially are luxuries in certain families. We don't actually need more than one car, and with that, we should use those taxes to fund public transport so that there will be no need for more than one car in each family. However, this is up for discussion, and I think that it is important to keep in mind that not every family is the same, so we should possibly tailor it to the amount of people in each family. And this idea is very much in line with our Renewable Energy Act, which intends to increase our renewable energy use in a national scale. So this tax is to ensure that even if the national budget has no allocation or minimal allocation, the environmental sector will still have funding for environmental sector growth. And this should not, we should keep in mind that this should not apply to basic necessities, as this tax might be burdensome for certain parts of the community. And a very good illustration would be there are multiple sustainable options available nowadays. However, it is of a higher price range, so it's not exactly affordable for certain communities. So it is not fair to impose this carbon tax on basic necessities, as this would put a burden upon a certain community in Malaysia. So that's about implementation, and that's basically it about my pitch. I would just like to kind of talk to you about steps that can be taken on our individual capacities. So the first step, I think, is to just choose the option which leaves the least amount of carbon footprint. And this is not an exhaustive list. You can further improve, and I would love to hear ideas if you have any. I guess you can bring it up during the Q&A session if you have time for that. It's open for discussion. So my list is opt for public transport, opt for pre-loved items instead of fast fashion, and bring your own containers when you take away. And the second step is, of course, by getting involved. So join NGOs like MYD, participate in environmental discussions and forums, just like what you're doing today. And I would like to applaud everyone for being here today and spending your time with us to participate in such an important and crucial discussion. And after you participate in this environmental discussion and forums, spread awareness among your community, because do not keep the knowledge to yourself. You should share the knowledge so that with that we can bring a bigger climate movement, a bigger wave, a bigger change to the world. And with that, I end my presentation. Thank you so much for sticking with me tonight. And I look forward to your questions during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juchi, for that interesting presentation on introducing the environmental taxation policy. I will now invite our third speaker, Roshwinder, also from MYD, to present on introducing a new legislation called Ecocide. Roshwinder, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Julian, for the lovely introduction. So today I'm going to talk about Ecocide and implementing Ecocide law in Malaysia. Well, everyone would be wondering, what is Ecocide? Well, Ecocide simply means the destruction of the natural environment, especially when deliberately done. So what can constitute to an act of ecocide? Things like open burning, water pollution, air pollution, deforestation, and so on and so forth are the things that would be constituted as an ecocide. Well, due to the time constraint, I can't talk about all the ecocide issues that is currently happening in Malaysia. So I've decided to pick one, which is deforestation, something that is very close to my heart because I love the forest. The deforestation is one of the ongoing environmental issues that we are all facing since 2019. And this deforestation has been happening in the permanent forest reserve, which are supposed to be under the official protection. Well, researchers says that the deforestation impact is likely to be on the wildlife, and also it affects the forest dependent indigenous people. A recent case study that was done where 15 Batik residents of a village of Kuala Koh died, and more than 100 others were hospitalized due to a mysterious illness. Our government said that the death was caused by measles, but experts says that extremely high level of manganese in their drinking water due to unpermitted forestry activities was responsible. It is also identified that the loss of forests make the indigenous communities more vulnerable to illnesses, referring to the deforestation of their home as a structural genocide. Besides that, these are evidence of Taman Negara indicating deforestation that is happening. These photos were snapped not too long ago. It was taken in July 2019 and the other was in August 2019, approximately a year ago. As you can all see, the circle in red shows within 2 months how much of deforestation activities have taken place and how much of our hills has been dibotakkan. I mean, has been trimmed. So it is pretty alarming to see the rate of the deforestation activities that is ongoing currently in Malaysia. And again, why can this happen? The question arises, why can this happen? Well, this happens because the Malaysian state government has the authority to spontaneously de-gazette forest reserve for development. The permanent forest reserve that is under the official protection can be de-gazetted. The area, like you can have maybe, let's say approximately 10 hectares of land of permanent forest reserve would be placed under official protection, but the state government can at any one point of time come up and say that, okay, we are going to de-gazette that area for development. So this has created a free-for-all with loggers rushing in to clear the forest and sell timber. Well, we do have laws to govern these forestry activities, which is the National Forestry Act 1984 and the National Forestry Policy 1978. But the issue that we face is that these laws are not criminalized. So the legislation are designed to ensure that forest management areas should be protected from any unpermitted activities. But in the event if someone found breaching those laws, they are only punishable by fines or getting their license suspended or merely revoked. There are no hefty punishment that is imposed when someone destroys the environment. It doesn't balance where you destroy the environment, the impact is so much, but your punishment is to the minimum. People may just continue their deforestation activities by paying the fines, and just says that I'm done, I've served my punishment, I've paid my fines, and they'll carry on. So that is why I said it is very, very important for us to criminalize the act of ecocide. So how can this ecocide law help us? Implementing ecocide law is basically to criminalize the act of ecocide done by anyone. There are so many countries such as Georgia, Armenia, Ukraine, Belarus, and etc. has recognized ecocide as a crime. By criminalizing ecocide, stricter sentence can be imposed, such as jail terms and whipping to the offenders. This would only deter people from committing any act that would actually destroy the environment. Well, we all know about Polly Higgins, a person who tried to criminalize the act of ecocide on an international level. She tried to recognize this crime in the International Crimes Court so that anyone in this world would be bound by this law and they would not do anything that would constitute to an act of ecocide. She has recently passed away. unfortunately. But I hope that we can carry on this battle to enforce ecocide laws and criminalize them so that uh, people who are destroying our environment would be brought down to justice. Uh, well, in Malaysia, how can we implement ecocide law or probably push ecocide law to be recognized? Uh, One of the things that we can do is by raising awareness about ecocide, like what we are doing right now. This is to put political pressure, uh, and also like where political parties would be like, uh, if we do not introduce ecocide law or do not implement ecocide law, we won't get the vote. So they would be pressured to actually introduce these kind of laws. Of course, the cons are public may not show interest, but we can try to give as much information that can really trigger the people. We have another way uh, going through law where it's called judicial review. Judicial review is a process where we can challenge decisions made by the ministry. Where if so, in the event where the ministry, the state government decides to de-gazette a certain part of the forest, we can take an action, a court action, to review their decision to de-gazette. The pros is effective, very, very effective, but the cons is very stringent. It's very, very difficult to be successful in a judicial review proceedings. Before I leave, I would want to tell you guys and remind you guys that the recent issue that we all faced was the water pollution that happened uh, in Rawang, where the factory have polluted the river, which have affected hundreds of thousands of residents in the Klang Valley. Businesses were affected because of the act of certain people that did not care about our environment. They have decided to pollute the river. We all suffered. Uh, if we had a law to bring these people down to justice, this would be ecocide law. The problem is we don't have such laws. If we can recognize ecocide as a crime, or we can even criminalize the act of ecocide, justice would be served. People would not do this kind of act to pollute the air, to pollute the water, to pollute the environment. I really hope that ecocide would one day be recognized as a crime and would be recognized as a law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roshwinder, for that presentation on introducing a new legislation called ecocide. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention. That concluded the pitching session. We now have a time for Q&A, during which you can ask questions to all the three presenters. Thank you. Welcome everyone to the live Q&A. So we already have some questions that are coming in. Okay, for the first question, I'll take it since it was directed at me as the moderator. So the question was from Ling Ping Chiu from Solar Wind Empire. And the question was, I projected more rain, higher river flow volume during wet season during the introduction that I gave. And the question is, what about the other side of the spectrum? Will droughts be more drier and hotter? And which extremes will last longer? So just to clarify, the projections were not mine. The projections were from NESTEC, the Ministry of Environment, Science, Technology, and Climate Change. And it was from their second biennial update to the UNFCCC. And while I had mostly talked about rainfall and river flow, I had also mentioned that there are projections for increase in air temperature in Malaysia, over Malaysia, so that would make heat waves more likely. And also in that same report that NESTEC produced for UNFCCC, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, there were also projections for more frequent droughts and dry spells in future, especially because of likely more frequent El Nino phenomenon globally. So this would have an impact on the weather in Malaysia as well, and would likely lead to more frequent dry seasons. And from the report, at this point in time, it's difficult to make projections whether or not like droughts will be more frequent or floods will be more frequent. What does seem likely though is that Malaysia will get both more frequent dry spells and more severe flooding. So it's sort of like the worst of both worlds, really. So at some points in time, we'll have too much water, too much rainfall and flooding. At other points of the year, we will have like severe dry spells and heat waves. So I hope that answers the question. So the next question is for me, or what about how about the CO2 captured and stored as biomass by the phytoplanktons?
Okay, for sure. Thank you, Julian, for the questions. So basically, for a blue carbon policy, there are actually two ecosystems that we have to consider. They are coastal ecosystem and they are marine ecosystem. I actually proposed that blue carbon policy specific for the coastal ecosystem. The reason why is because if we have much more understanding on it as compared to the marine ecosystem, and then also in coastal ecosystem we have higher carbon stocks, and they can also support a long-term carbon storage. And of course, I think the phytoplanktons also can be one of the potential of blue carbon, but there's a limited understanding on that. There's gap understanding on how can we assess the carbon stock on the biomass of phytoplanktons. And then because of this limited understanding, there's a limited potential for management and counting for carbon sequestration on this front. So I guess in the future, we have more understanding and research on that, and then we can venture more towards a marine ecosystem. But as for now, we can go on something that we know quite well already, which is on the coastal ecosystem, blue carbon policy. Yeah.
Thank you, Mio, for that response. Next question is also for you. Like, what would be your proposed focus area in the blue carbon policy?
The focus area on blue carbon policy. I actually mentioned three right at the moment. First would be on the conservation part, second in the carbon stock assessment, and third would be trying to bridge between the scientific understanding and the policy making. But I think the focus area right now we should go towards more on the coastal habitat conservation, because the thing with mangrove forest, for example, if it's getting damaged, it can incur like a course enormous carbon emitted back to in the atmosphere. So if we destroy the ecosystem, the carbon that actually been stored will be emitted. So somehow, somewhat, we should be able to conserve that so that the carbon will not be emitted. And then a part of that, if we can be able to conserve our coastal ecosystem, it can benefit the community in terms of recreational. Also, it can become a storm protection for us. In case of tsunami comes in, it can dampen down the effect, and it also can be a really good nursery ground for the fisheries. So yeah, the focus area right now we should be on the conservation of coastal habitat. Yep.
Yeah, so your presentation has triggered a lot of interest. So another question for you. What is the level of urgency in implementing such blue carbon policy in Malaysia and why?
The urgency. Okay, cool. So I think for me it would be at it's just a personal view, but it will be at a medium rate, because the the issue with our mangrove forest, I think it is the mangrove cover is decreasing at an alarming rate. On the latest report that I think I read from the Forest Research Institute Malaysia on the status of mangrove in Malaysia, we actually have lost around 20,000 hectares of mangrove cover from 1990 to 2017. So this mangrove loss is happening, and then the projection that I read from around the world is actually around 3%, 3 to 5% uh, mangrove cover loss all over around the world. So we have to dampen this mangrove loss basically. So it's quite urgent for us to start taking action so we can reduce the loss even more. If we want to see it on site, if we see at the Tanjung Piai, you can actually see the impact is quite extensive. Where it was supposed to be a mangrove forest, it become less and less, and it's quite sad to see the Tanjung Piai National Parks being looking like that, because it's supposed to be one of our Ramsar site, and we should be able to conserve it. So in totality, why we have to do coastal habitat conservation in this one, because 85% of our mangrove forests are actually under permanent reserve. So it's a permanent reserve forest, and there's a 15% which under state land authority. So what we can do here is basically to gazette the rest of it, the rest which is the 15%, and make it into a permanent reserve forest so that we can totally conserve the mangrove cover that we had right now. Yeah, I think that's my answer, Julian.
Thank you very much, Mio, for that response.
Yeah.
Now, next up, we have a question. Well, actually, it's more of a comment for Zichi, and perhaps you can respond to this. So basically, the comment is carbon tax is not an appropriate instrument for a developing country, the likes of Malaysia. However, under UNFCCC 1992, all developing countries have common responsibility, but with differentiated accountability. Just like many developing countries, Malaysia has common responsibility to reduce our carbon intensity in proportion to our economic capacity and stage of development, and has pledged since COP24 to reduce carbon intensity by 45% from 2005 level, provided the last 10% will receive some support from developed countries. So, like, what do you make then of this comment in regards to your proposal for the carbon tax?
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for your comment. I think that is a very valid statement, and I do agree that national carbon trading might be the way to go. Nonetheless, the carbon market was first introduced through the Kyoto Protocol, which is a sub-agreement under the UNFCCC, and now it's trying to be implemented through the current Paris Agreement. And however, it's been pretty problematic ever since COP 25th, if I'm not mistaken, in Madrid. There have been issues with hashing out the market rules because carbon trading has been problematic ever since Kyoto Protocol, although certain countries have benefited from it because there has been severe environmental impacts like loss of habitats of indigenous people and species because certain companies only want it to look good on paper, but they don't actually care of the loss of habitat of indigenous people as well as species. So because of that, the market rules have not been successfully hashed out through the Paris Agreement. So there is no proper implementation of it yet. So for now, that is why I brought my proposition of the carbon tax. So the carbon tax is only imposed through non-necessities. So basically, it's only imposed upon communities who can afford to pay for carbon tax. So for instance, for luxury items and so on, so that we can encourage Malaysians to cultivate a sustainable lifestyle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juchi, for that response. There's another question for you coming up, and that is, you mentioned the carbon tax should be introduced gradually. How would you suggest to prioritize the rollout?
Okay, I guess this was pretty similar as to what I've responded before this. So, to keep it simple, it can start off with non-essential items or perhaps luxury items in a way that it doesn't burden the B40 community. So, for instance, I propose that we impose the carbon tax on the second car of the family, so it does not strike the community as too much of a surprise, and we can try to introduce it in a lower percentage. So perhaps it's only 2%, and we can gradually increase it. So that's my proposition. Thank you.
Thank you, Juchi, for that question, for that response. Okay, next up we have a question for Rashwinder. So a bulk of states' revenue is directly linked to the use of land and exploitation of natural resources such as forests, water, minerals, etc. So according to Article 110, bracket 1 of the Federal Constitution. And states get very little and no direct revenue from other big economic activities such as manufacturing, tourism, logistics, and others. Is there a possibility to change this so states can make money from these big economic activities instead? They can evade the ecocide law using this too, right?
Yeah, all right. It's a very, very good question. About changing the federal constitution, you definitely can change the federal constitution, but you need a two-third majority in the parliament to pass this. Then they can change the federal constitution, which would include having activities such as manufacturing, tourism, logistic, and others to make this as the main source of income. uh, can be done, yeah, but it's right now with the political uncertainty that we have, it's pretty difficult to change the federal constitution. All right, and then can they evade ecocide law using this? No, they can't, because ecocide law, if what I'm trying to pitch over here is to pitch ecocide law into the penal code, which will be binding to all citizens. So everyone would be bound by ecocide law. So they can't evade that, because ecocide law is basically a simple, straightforward law which states that if you destroy the environment deliberately, you'll be fined. So what constitutes to destroying the environment? It can be anything and everything which constitute to destroying an environment, from polluting the river, or maybe you have a factory which releases a lot of carbon gases, and so on and so forth. They would be bound by ecocide law. So anything which constitutes to deliberate destroyment of the environment, they would be bound by ecocide law. So it will be applicable to anyone and everyone at all states. It can be you can be a company, you can be a person, it can be anyone. They would be bound by it. Yeah.
Thank you, Rashwinder. Next up, there is another sort of question. It's actually more of a comment for you as well. And how will you respond to this? So it's the comment is the proposed ecocide law is biased and not appropriate. Should such a law be considered, it should cover all sectors of the economy, not only deforestation. So what do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, like I said just now, ecocide law is not only for deforestation. It is on a whole where you destroy the environment on a whole. It can be any type of act that destroys the environment. Can be anything. Can be water pollution, air pollution, whatever. As long as the act that you do constitute to a deliberate act which destroys the environment, you would be bound by ecocide law. So it's not only for deforestation, it's open to any uh, what we call natural any act which which constitutes to destroying the natural environment would be bound to this law.
Thank you very much, Roshinda, for the response. Next up, I have a question. There is a question for Zhiqi. And the question is, are there any big Malaysian corporations that are starting to implement carbon tax for their projects abroad?
Okay, thank you for this question. And I have to apologize that I have not read on this, but I'll be happy to give you an answer after I've done my reading. I'll reply to you via email. So I'll just look through the question list and I'll get back to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Zhiqi. And yes, to the person who asked the question, as mentioned, Zhiqi can follow up on this. So keep your questions coming. We have our speakers all here. Yeah, keep the questions coming. So we have another question that just came in. It's to Rashwinder. So what do you think is the acceptance level of Malaysians towards the ecocide concept?
Right now, I think the acceptance is growing. I can see, especially youngsters, they are starting to carry metal straws to reduce the plastic usage and things like that. So I think it's looking positive, but let's see how it goes in the future. But I think yeah, we can move forward to accepting ecocide concept.
Okay, thanks for that response. Okay, next up we have a question again for Mior. So the question is, I agree we need to take stock of what we have for us to effectively develop initiatives related to blue carbon. Do you think we can rely on public funding to take this on, with resources now mostly focused on COVID, or will it be more effective to seek private funding?
Okay, thanks, Lina, for the question. Thanks for the poster question. For me, I have not reading extensively on how we're going to fund these carbon stock assessment practices and how can we do it. But I think in current situation, it might be appropriate for us to let the public funding to continue to support the COVID response as for now. But in the future, if we had chance, obviously, this is something that we should tap into and we should do it. But I guess that it can also be helpful if we try to find a fund from private investors or from get a private funding, because this could also be part of the CSR activities. One of the things about we can do is to make it into a carbon market. So any profit that we get from this carbon market should benefit back to the communities that are living over there. An example I can give is in Kampung Kilim in Langkawi. There's a small community over there in Kampung that very reliant on the Kilim Geoforest Park, and a part of it has the mangrove forest, and they've been cultivating, they've been trying to conserve the mangrove forest there. But the thing is, for you to reforest a mangrove, it takes quite a long time. Also, it needs a continuous effort, and I guess a private entity would be more interested to have this in a long run. So yeah, that's my perspective.
Thank you very much, Mior, for the insightful response. So next up, there is a comment with a question at the end. So the comment is, thank you all for the amazing insights, and I really enjoyed it. I was curious about this one question while I was reading a blog about climate change. It's something about time and change that was intrigued because of what we know the world is dying. So the question goes, will the actions we take today be enough to forestall the direct impacts of climate change, or is it too little, too late? So I'll take this question since it's a general one. So what I would say is that, yes, the situation seems dire. It seems that maybe too late that we're on track for climate change. However, I think it's important not to fall into despair. It's important to keep hope, because there is a basis for hope. There is a small and shrinking chance, but there is still a chance that we can turn things around. This is why we have, for example, this pitching session, this iGEM pitching session to talk about climate solutions. Because if we act now, with the resources we have and with ongoing technological progress, we can make a difference. We can turn things around. We can help to stop catastrophic climate change from happening. But the window of opportunity is closing, and closing rapidly. So we have to act quickly. And for example, we need to take up the solutions that are being pitched this week, all throughout this week, for example, by my MYD colleagues, and start acting on them and act quickly and devote resources to them to develop new technologies, develop new policies, and also shift social norms so that we change our ways of living and being, so that we ensure that we have a planet that's still habitable and sustainable now and into the future. So I hope that answers the question. Okay, next up, we have a question for Zhuqi, and this is about the carbon tax. So it starts off by saying that this is meaningless. The carbon tax is meaningless when the government has not yet removed the fuel subsidy on fuel use for power generation industry. So the carbon tax would be justified after all fuel subsidies have been eliminated. Can you justify the carbon tax otherwise?
Okay, first of all, thank you for your question. Thank you for your comment. I really get where you're coming from, and I totally agree with you that it seems to be quite a paradox if we were to just implement carbon tax and continue the fuel subsidy. So as mentioned in my pitch, the carbon tax will need to be imposed in stages. So if we were to remove the subsidy completely and abruptly, it will not be reasonable, because a lot of our communities still rely on the fuel subsidy to make ends meet. So these funds, basically we need to reduce the subsidies by stages, but we can also implement the carbon tax in stages as well. So it happens simultaneously. So this slowly reduces our dependency upon petroleum fuel. And these funds collected through carbon tax will then can be made to improve public transport facilities. So it makes it more accessible for everyone. So meaning that certain parts of our communities who have used to rely on petroleum fuels will no longer be as reliant, because our public transport facilities are more accessible to them. So basically, my proposition is that fuel subsidy needs to be reduced and carbon tax will need to be imposed in stages. So these two have to happen simultaneously. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Zhuqi, for that response. We have one last question, and it's quite related as well to the previous one. So it's, how would you justify the carbon tax on fossil fuels in Malaysia, since the country relies heavily on fossil fuels as a main economic contributor?
Okay, so yes, of course, based on my reading, I know that Malaysia's economic activities are heavily reliant on fossil fuels, and I'll have to admit that. However, Malaysia is also home to the production of palm oil, which is one of the readily available alternative renewable resources. And thus, I propose that what can be done is to encourage the use of palm oil as an alternative to generate energy. So by imposing the carbon tax, the intention is to encourage big corporations to opt for more sustainable resources. So meaning that we impose the carbon tax upon the big corporations, so there is actual structural change in Malaysia rather than depending on individuals to take action. We need to push for structural change. So by imposing the carbon tax upon big corporations, then they are kind of forced to choose a more renewable and greener source rather than fully relying on fossil fuels. So it's basically trying to cut the dependency on fossil fuels. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Juchi, for that insightful response. So thank you everyone who has been asking questions. We've come to the end of the time for the Q&A. So we've now started the polling for the about the pitches. So please vote for your favorite pitches, and so that we know who will win tonight's pitching session.